My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 61 years old, and until last Christmas Eve, I believed that a man's worth was measured by the weight of the burdens he carried for others. I've spent my life in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a town where your handshake is your bond, and your reputation is the only thing the wind can't blow away. I lived by a simple code. Work until your knuckles bleed, speak only when you have something to say, and never let the people you love feel the cold. But on that snowy night in Virginia, as the smell of rosemary chicken filled the air and the fire crackled in the hearth, I learned that you can spend decades building a home only to find out you're nothing more than the hired help who pays the mortgage. The moment the world shifted wasn't loud. It didn't start with a scream. It started with a chair. Not just any chair, but a heavy, hand-carved oak seat that my grandfather had built during the Great Depression. It was the captain's chair. It had traveled with me through my first marriage, my years of widowerhood, and finally into the split-level home I shared with my second wife, Sarah. For 3 years, that chair sat at the head of our holiday table. It was the anchor of my life. To me, it represented leadership, sacrifice, and the fact that I had finally earned a place where I belonged. But as the candles flickered and the wine was poured, my stepson, Marcus, didn't see an anchor. He saw an obstacle. Marcus is 34, a man who carries himself with the unearned confidence of someone who has never had to pay for his own mistakes. He had been drifting for years. Bad investments, business trips that were really just vacations funded by Sarah's secret credit cards, and a lingering resentment toward me for simply existing in the space his biological father once occupied. His father, Julian, was a man of charm and zero substance, a ghost who only appeared when he needed an audience or a loan. This year, Julian was the guest of honor, invited by Sarah because she claimed Marcus needed closure. I was standing at the head of the table, the carving knife in my hand, ready to serve the family I had worked 2 jobs to support. I looked at Sarah, expecting a smile. Instead, I saw her looking at Julian with a soft, nostalgic glow I hadn't seen in years. That's when I felt the hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a touch of affection, it was a grip of steel. "Move, Elias," Marcus said. His voice was flat, devoid of the respect I had tried to earn by paying off his student loans and fixing his car every time he ran it into a ditch. I turned, confused. "Excuse me, Marcus." "You heard me," he sneered, his eyes darting to Julian, who was smirking from the sidelines. "This is the head of the table. It belongs to a real Thorne. It belongs to my father. You're just the guy who keeps the lights on. Now get out of the seat." I felt a flush of heat crawl up my neck. "Marcus, this is my house. This is my father's chair. Sit down and let's eat." I didn't see the shove coming. Marcus, fueled by some twisted sense of loyalty to a man who had abandoned him a dozen times, slammed his palms into my chest. I wasn't prepared for the violence of it. My boots slipped on the polished hardwood, my heel caught the rug, and I went down. My hip hit the floor with a sickening thud that echoed in the silent room. The bowl of hot gravy I was reaching for tipped, spilling a thick brown stain across my white shirt and pooling onto the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. The Christmas tree lights blinked, red, green, blue, mocking the chaos on the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from the pain in my hip, but from the sudden, chilling clarity of the scene. I looked up, waiting for Sarah to scream. Waiting for her to rush to my side to berate her son, to tell Marcus he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But Sarah didn't move toward me. She looked at the floor. She looked at the gravy seeping into the expensive wood I had spent 3 weekends refinishing. "Oh, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling not with anger but with annoyance. "Look at the mess. Marcus, grab some towels. Julian, I'm so sorry about this." She stepped over my legs to get to the kitchen. She stepped over me like I was a fallen branch in the yard, something to be cleared away, something that was inconveniencing the path. She started blotting the floor, her back to me, her focus entirely on the hardwood. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like glass breaking. "Guess the old man can't hold his weight anymore," Julian remarked, pulling out the captain's chair and sitting down with a sigh of satisfaction. I stayed on the floor for a moment longer than I needed to. The coldness I felt wasn't from the draft under the door. It was the realization that I had spent years pouring my life's blood into a vessel that was full of holes. I was the maintenance man. I was the one who fixed the roof, the one who filled the fridge, the one who ensured the retirement accounts were healthy. But I wasn't the man at the table. I pushed myself up, my hips screaming in protest. I didn't look at Marcus, who was standing over me with a defiant chest. I didn't look at Julian, who was already reaching for the wine. I looked at the back of my wife's head as she scrubbed the floor. "Sarah," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a tone she had never heard from me before. "Not now, Elias," she snapped, still scrubbing. "Can we just have one night without a scene? Just go change your shirt. We'll talk about it tomorrow." "Tomorrow," I repeated. The word felt hollow. I walked out of the dining room. I didn't go upstairs to change. I walked to the mudroom, grabbed my heavy coat, and stepped out into the biting Virginia winter. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but it felt honest. I climbed into my truck, the engine groaning as it turned over. I sat there in the driveway, watching the warm, yellow light of the house through the falling snow. Inside, I could see shadows moving, heads turning, laughter erupting. They were eating. They were celebrating. They hadn't even noticed I hadn't come back. I put the truck in reverse and backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the ice. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was leaving behind. As I drove toward the dark silhouette of the mountains, my phone began to buzz in the cup holder. I didn't answer. I knew the script. Sarah would call to tell me I was being dramatic. Marcus would text to tell me to bring back more beer. But as I reached the edge of town, a notification popped up on my dashboard screen, a high-priority alert from my banking app. Unauthorized attempt to access line of credit. My blood turned to ice. I pulled over to the side of the road, the heater blasting, and opened the app. It wasn't just a notification. It was a massacre. A series of documents had been uploaded to the bank's portal an hour ago, digital signatures, scanned IDs, and a request for a $60,000 draw against my home equity. And there, at the bottom of the digital application, was my name. Not Elias Thorne, the name I used for every legal document in my life. It was Eli, the pet name only Sarah used when we were alone. Someone had forged my soul. I sat in the cab of my truck, the silence of the Virginia woods pressing in on me from all sides. The glow of my phone screen was the only light in the world, and it felt like a brand, searing the truth into my retinas. $60,000. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't a family misunderstanding. That was a calculated strike. I looked at the digital signature, Eli Thorne, and felt a wave of nausea. The loops of the E were too round, the I dotted with a flourish that didn't belong to me. It belonged to the woman currently sitting at my dinner table, probably pouring wine for the man who had just taken my seat. I thought back to 3 months ago, when Sarah had mentioned that Marcus was looking into a franchise opportunity. I had told her no. I had told her that the equity in this house was our safety net, the result of 30 years of sweat and missed vacations. I remember her face that night. She didn't argue. She just went quiet and offered to make me tea. Now I realized that silence wasn't agreement. It was the sound of her shifting gears, deciding that if I wouldn't give her what she wanted, she would simply take it while I was sleeping. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Sarah. Elias, stop being a child. Marcus is sorry he pushed you, but you shouldn't have been so aggressive about the chair. Come back and apologize so we can finish dinner. Julian is leaving soon. I didn't reply. My thumb hovered over the block button, but I stopped. No, I needed to see the play. I needed to know how deep this hole went. I drove to a small, 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, a place called the Rusty Spoon. It was the kind of place where the waitresses knew your name and the coffee was strong enough to peel paint. I sat in a corner booth, my hip throbbing with every movement, and opened my laptop. I had been the primary breadwinner, but Sarah handled the household digital filing. I had trusted her with the passwords, the scans of our birth certificates, the digital keys to our life. As I logged into our shared cloud drive, my heart was racing. I began to dig. I found a folder buried 3 layers deep, labeled Garden Projects. Inside were no sketches of flower beds or stone paths. It was a digital paper trail of a life I didn't recognize. There were emails between Sarah and a private lender, specializing in high-interest home equity draws. There were drafts of the loan application where she had practiced my signature. But the most crushing discovery was a series of messages between Sarah and Marcus from just 2 weeks ago. "He'll never notice, Mom," Marcus had written. "By the time the first statement comes, the investment will already be paying out. We'll put the money back before he even looks at the accounts. He's old, he doesn't check the portal unless I break something." Sarah's response was a knife to my ribs. "I know, honey, he's become so rigid about money. It's like he forgets this is my home too. Don't worry, I'll handle the Eli part. He's been so tired lately, he won't even remember signing it. He's old. He's rigid." I stared at those words until they blurred. I wasn't a husband to her. I was an obstacle to be bypassed, a bank to be robbed with a smile and a kiss on the cheek. They were waiting for me to forget. They were betting on my decline, counting on my exhaustion to cover their theft. Around 2:00 a.m., I checked my credit monitoring service. The $60,000 draw was just the tip of the iceberg. There were 2 new credit cards in Marcus's name, but I was listed as the primary cardholder. They had been used for business expenses, high-end suits, electronics, and a 4-night stay at a resort in the Outer Banks. My credit score, which I had guarded like a hawk for 40 years, was hemorrhaging. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the swirling snow. I thought about the kitchen I'd remodeled for Sarah. I thought about the time I'd spent teaching Marcus how to change his oil, how to swing a hammer, how to be a man of his word. I realized then that you can provide the tools, but you can't provide the character. The pain in my hip flared again, a sharp, biting reminder of the floor, the gravy, and the laughter. Something inside me, something that had been warm and accommodating for far too long, finally went cold. I wasn't going back to that house to talk. I wasn't going back to apologize. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, then I would show them what a stranger with a legal team looks like. I called my brother Silas. He's a retired sheriff's deputy 3 counties over, a man who knows the difference between a family spat and a crime. "Elias." Silas's voice was thick with sleep. "It's 2 a.m, everything okay?" "No," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. I need you to tell me the name of that fraud investigator you used to work with, the one who doesn't do favors for anyone. Silas was silent for a long beat. This about Sarah's boy? It's about the whole house, Silas. I hit the floor tonight. And while I was down there, they started picking my pockets. I'll text you the number, Silas said, his voice now sharp and alert. But Elias, once you start this, there's no turning back. You know that, right? You're talking about your wife. She stopped being my wife when she started practicing my signature, I replied. I hung up and watched the snow. I knew what would happen next. They would expect me to come home, head bowed, ready to make peace. They would expect me to see the loan, get angry, and then eventually succumb to Sarah's tears and Marcus's empty promises of paying it back. That had been the pattern for years. I was the fixer. I was the one who made the problems go away. But this time, I wasn't going to fix the problem. I was going to be the problem. I spent the rest of the night in that diner, fueled by bitter coffee and a growing sense of resolve. I downloaded every email, every forged document, and every unauthorized transaction. I organized them into a single, encrypted file. I felt like a soldier prepping a battlefield. As the sun began to peek over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and cold orange, I received one last text from Marcus. Hey Tom, just saw the alert. Must be a glitch with the bank. Don't go calling them and making a scene. I'll head down there in the morning and straighten it out. Just stay home and relax. You looked pretty shaky last night. He was still trying to manage me. He was still treating me like a senile old man who couldn't be trusted to handle his own affairs. I didn't reply. I just started the truck and headed toward the one place where family didn't mean a thing, the local police precinct. The precinct was quiet at 7 in the morning, the air smelling of floor wax and burnt coffee. I sat in a plastic chair, my hip throbbing with a rhythmic heat that reminded me I wasn't as young as I used to be. I waited for Detective Miller, the man Silas had recommended. When he finally called me back, his office was small and cluttered, the walls covered in charts and half-finished reports. He looked at me, a tired man in a stained flannel shirt, and didn't see a victim. He saw a case. I didn't lead with my feelings. I led with the file. I laid out the printed emails, the forged loan application, and the credit card statements. I told him about the shove, the gravy, and the laughter. I told him how my wife of 7 years had turned my name into a weapon against me. Miller flipped through the pages with a practiced, neutral expression. Mr. Thorne, he said, leaning back, this isn't a simple identity theft case. This is domestic financial abuse. Your wife had access to your data, but she used it to commit felony forgery. $60,000 is enough to send someone away for a long time. Are you sure you want to press this? Once the DA gets this, I can't pull it back for you. I spent my life building that name, Detective, I said. I worked double shifts at the mill so Sarah could have the life she wanted. I paid for Marcus's mistakes because I thought that's what a father does, but I'm not a father to them. I'm an ATM. If I don't stop this now, they'll bury me in debt before I'm in the ground. Press the charges. I left the station and drove to my lawyer's office. If I was going to lose my home and my family, I was going to do it on my terms. I filed for an immediate legal separation and an injunction to freeze all shared accounts. By noon, the digital walls were closing in on Sarah and Marcus. I changed my phone number and checked into a small motel on the highway. I needed a place where no one knew my name, where I could just be Elias, not Eli, not Tom, just a man in a room. The calls started around 3:00 p.m. not to my new number, but to the motel room phone. Sarah had tracked me down through our shared car GPS. I picked up once. "Elias, what have you done?" she screamed. Her voice was high and panicked, the sound of a woman who had finally realized the floor was gone. "The bank called. They said there's a fraud investigation." Marcus tried to use his card at the grocery store and it was declined. "He's humiliated. How could you do this to your own family?" "You didn't think about my humiliation when I was on the kitchen floor, Sarah," I said, my voice as cold as the mountain wind. "You didn't think about family when you signed Eli on a $60,000 debt. You didn't want a husband, you wanted a benefactor. Well, the bank is closed." "We were going to pay it back," she sobbed. "It was for Marcus's future. You're so selfish, Elias. You've always been so obsessed with your rules and your credit. It's just money." "It's not just money, Sarah. It's my life. It's every hour I spent away from home working while you and your son laughed behind my back. Don't call this room again." I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed. I felt a strange, hollow lightness. The grief was there, a heavy stone in my gut, but the fog was gone. I spent the afternoon drafting a letter to Marcus's biological father, Julian. I knew Julian was a shark, but sharks respect power. I told him that if he wanted to sit in the captain's chair so badly, he could start by paying for his son's legal defense. The next morning, the local paper had a small blurb about a financial fraud investigation at a prominent local address. It didn't name me, but in a town this small, everyone knew. My sister-in-law, Diane, sent me a message through a mutual friend. She called me a cold-hearted bastard. She said Sarah was a mess and that I was ruining Marcus's life over a little mistake. It's amazing how people view theft as a mistake when they aren't the ones being robbed. I didn't stay in hiding. I went back to the house 2 days later with a moving truck and 2 off-duty officers Silas had arranged. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to reclaim my history. When I pulled into the driveway, Sarah was standing on the porch, her face pale and sunken. Marcus was there too, looking less like a tough guy and more like a cornered animal. "You brought the police," Marcus spat, though he stayed 5 feet away from me this time. "To your own home?" "It's not my home anymore," I said. "It's a crime scene." I walked past them into the dining room. The house still smelled like Christmas, pine needles, and cinnamon, but it felt like a tomb. I walked straight to the head of the table. My grandfather's chair was still there. Julian wasn't sitting in it today. I gripped the worn oak arms, the wood cool and familiar under my palms. I remembered my father sitting in this chair, telling me that a man who doesn't respect himself can never expect respect from others. "Move," I said to Marcus, even though he wasn't in my way. I wanted him to feel the weight of the word. I watched as the movers loaded the chair into the truck. Then the dining table, then my father's old desk. I took everything that had a soul. I left the new kitchen I'd built. I left the expensive rugs and the flat-screen TV. I left the things that money could buy because those things didn't belong to me anymore. They belonged to the debt Sarah had created. As the truck pulled away, Sarah walked up to the window. "Where are you going, Elias?" "What am I supposed to do?" "You have the house, Sarah," I said. "And you have the $60,000 loan you wanted so badly. I'm sure Marcus and Julian will help you with the payments." I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. My hip still hurt, and my heart felt like it had been scraped raw, but for the first time in years I could breathe. I was heading to a small cabin I owned near the river, a place Sarah had always hated because it didn't have style. It had 4 walls, a wood stove, and a porch that faced the sunrise. But the battle wasn't over. A week later, I received a summons. Sarah wasn't going down without a fight. She was suing for spousal abandonment and claiming that I had orally authorized the loan during a night of heavy drinking, a night that never happened. She was trying to paint me as a senile alcoholic. I sat by the wood stove in my cabin, reading the legal papers. I looked at my hands, calloused and steady. They thought I was a weak old man they could push around. They thought I would fold because I loved her. But they forgot one thing. I was a man who had survived the mills and the mountains. I knew how to weather a storm. I called my lawyer and gave him the last piece of the puzzle, the voice recordings I'd made on my old work phone months ago. I had started recording our financial discussions because I'd noticed small amounts of money disappearing. I had a recording of Sarah explicitly asking for the loan and me saying, "Absolutely not. Do not touch the equity." "This is the nail in the coffin, Elias," my lawyer said. "They're going to offer a settlement. They'll beg you to drop the criminal charges." "Let them beg," I said. "I've spent enough time listening to them. Now it's time for them to listen to a judge." The courtroom was cold, a sterile vault of white marble and polished wood that felt worlds away from the warmth of the home I had tried to build. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my back straight, wearing the suit I had bought for my father's funeral. Across the aisle, Sarah looked smaller than I remembered. She was dressed in a conservative gray dress, her eyes downcast, playing the part of the grieving wife. Marcus sat beside her, his jaw set in a hard line, still radiating that toxic mix of arrogance and fear. Julian, the man of the hour from Christmas Eve, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished the moment the word, felony, entered the conversation, proving once and for all that a shark only stays as long as there's blood in the water. The judge was a woman named Eleanor Vance, known for a temperament that was as sharp as a razor and twice as cold. She didn't look at the people, she looked at the evidence. When she opened the file, the room went silent. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Vance began, her eyes boring into mine. "You are seeking a full annulment of the debt and are proceeding with criminal forgery charges against your wife and stepson. This is a rare path to take. Most families settle these matters behind closed doors. Are you certain this is how you wish to proceed?" "Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing in the chamber. "For years, I believed that love meant covering for people. I believed that my name was a safety net for everyone I cared about. But I've learned that when you let people walk all over you, they don't eventually stop out of gratitude. They just get better at finding where it hurts. This isn't just about $60,000. It's about the fact that I spent 7 years building a life with a woman who treated my identity like a blank check. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for the truth." Sarah's lawyer stood up, a young man who looked like he'd been hired for his ability to spin a tale. "Your Honor, my client was in a desperate state. She was trying to save her son from financial ruin. She believed she had implied consent because Mr. Thorne has historically paid for everything. This was a family matter that spiraled out of control. Implied consent does not include forging a signature on a deed of trust," Judge Vance snapped. "Now let's talk about the recordings." I watched Sarah's face drain of color as the bailiff prepared the audio equipment. My lawyer hit play. The sound of the cabin wood stove crackling filled the room, followed by my own voice, tired but firm. "Sarah, I'm telling you for the last time, that equity is our retirement. Do not go to the bank. Do not touch that money for Marcus. He needs to find a job, not a handout." Then came Sarah's voice, sharp and biting. "You're so selfish, Elias. You have all this money sitting there and you won't help your own son. You're just a miser. You'll never even know it's gone." The recording cut off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Marcus stared at the table, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "That doesn't sound like implied consent to me," the judge remarked. "It sounds like a direct warning that was ignored with criminal intent." The next hour was a blur of legal technicalities. Because I had the recordings and the evidence of the practiced signatures, the bank was forced to admit that their verification process had failed. The debt was stripped from my name and placed solely on Sarah. But the real blow came when Judge Vance turned her attention to Marcus. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "I've reviewed the text messages provided by the prosecution. You were not just a passive recipient of this money. You actively encouraged your mother to defraud a man who had treated you as his own. You spoke of him as maintenance. You spoke of him as old and forgetful. In this state, elder financial abuse is a serious charge." Marcus tried to speak, his voice cracking. I just wanted to start a business. I thought he'd be proud of me if I was successful." "You don't build a business on the bones of another man's labor," Judge Vance said. By the time we walked out of that courtroom, the world had changed. Sarah was facing a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation, provided she sold her share of the house to pay back the bank. Marcus was ordered to perform 500 hours of community service and pay restitution. But more importantly, he was barred from ever contacting me or accessing any account with my name on it. I stood on the courthouse steps, the winter sun feeling surprisingly warm on my face. Sarah walked up to me, her lawyer trailing behind her. She looked aged, the lines around her eyes deeper than they had been a week ago. "You really did it, Elias," she said, her voice hollow. "You destroyed us. Are you happy now? You have your name, you have your money, and you have that stupid chair, but you have no one." I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to apologize. I didn't feel the need to fix her pain. "I had no one while I was sitting at that table, Sarah," I said. "I just didn't know it yet. You didn't lose me today. You lost me the moment you decided I was a tool instead of a husband." She turned and walked away, Marcus following her like a beaten dog. I watched them go, and then I walked to my truck. I drove back to my cabin, the one by the river. When I got there, I walked inside and looked at the captain's chair. It was sitting by the window, the sunlight catching the grain of the oak. I sat down in it. I leaned back. The left leg gave that familiar, tiny squeak, the one I'd never quite fixed because it reminded me of my father. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the river. I was 61 years old. I was starting over with nothing but a truck, a cabin, and a name that was finally mine again. But the story didn't end with a quiet afternoon by the river. 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from a lawyer or a bank. It was a handwritten note from a woman I hadn't seen in 30 years, my first wife's sister, Martha. She had heard about the court case through the grapevine. "Elias," the note read, "I saw the news. I always knew you were a man of integrity, even when things got hard with Sarah. My father always said you were the only one who ever treated people with the respect they deserved. If you're ever up near the valley, come by for coffee. We're still family, even if the paperwork says otherwise." I held the note in my hand and felt a lump form in my throat. I had spent so long trying to force a family out of people who didn't want one that I had forgotten there were people who had valued me all along. I looked at the phone. I didn't call Sarah. I didn't check on Marcus. I dialed Martha's number. "Martha," I said when she answered. "It's Elias. I think I'd like that coffee." As I hung up, I looked out at the mountains. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing the dark, rich earth underneath. It was a new season. I had survived the floor, the gravy, and the betrayal. I had protected my name, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the drive. The drive to the valley was long, winding through the skeletal remains of the winter forest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to rush. I didn't have a list of chores waiting for me at home. No broken faucets to fix for a stepson who wouldn't thank me, and no icy silences to navigate with a wife who saw me as a shadow. My hip still twinged when I pressed the brake, but it was a dull, honest pain. It was the price of standing up. When I pulled into Martha's driveway, it felt like stepping back in time. It was a modest farmhouse, white with forest green shutters and a porch that wrapped around the front like a welcoming arm. Martha was waiting at the door. She looked like her sister, my late wife, Clara, but with a softness that came from a life lived with a clear conscience. "Elias Thorne," she said, stepping out and pulling me into a hug that smelled of lavender and wood smoke. "You look like you've been through a war." "I suppose I have, Martha," I said, letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since Christmas Eve. We sat in her kitchen, and for the first time in a decade, I was a guest who was actually wanted. We didn't talk about the court case at first. We talked about Clara, about the old days at the mill, and about how the town had changed. But eventually, the conversation turned to the elephant in the room. "I heard what you did," Martha said, setting a mug of coffee in front of me. "A lot of people in town are whispering. They say you were too hard on Sarah. That you should have handled it in the family." I looked into my coffee. "That's the problem with this town, Martha. People think family is a rug you can sweep any sin under. They think if you love someone, you're obligated to let them destroy you. I loved Sarah. I really did, but I realized that if I let her take my name and my dignity, I wouldn't have anything left to love her with." Martha nodded. "My father used to say that a man without his name is just a ghost haunting his own life." "You did the right thing, Elias. It takes a lot of courage to be the bad guy in a story just to keep the truth alive." As I sat there, I realized that my life wasn't over. It was just being pruned. The dead wood, the lies, the manipulation, the entitlement had been cut away. It was painful, yes, but it was necessary for anything new to grow. A month later, the house I had shared with Sarah was sold. After the bank took their $60,000 and the legal fees were settled, there wasn't much left. Sarah moved into a small apartment in the city, far away from the judgment of the Blue Ridge. Marcus, unable to find work in town, reportedly moved back in with Julian, though the rumors said they were already at each other's throats. I didn't seek out news of them. I didn't need the satisfaction of their struggle. My satisfaction came from a different source. I spent my weekends at the cabin, refinishing my grandfather's captain's chair one last time. I sanded away the scratches Marcus had left, the marks of the struggle. I polished the oak until it shone like a mirror. One evening, Silas came by the cabin. He brought a six-pack of beer and sat on the porch with me, watching the river rush by. "You look different, Elias," Silas said, popping a cap. "You look like you lost 50 pounds of lead." "I feel it," I said. "I spent so long trying to be the hero of a story that didn't want me. It's exhausting trying to earn a seat at a table where the deck is already stacked against you." "What are you going to do now?" he asked. "I'm going to live," I said simply. "I'm going to fish. I'm going to help Martha fix up her barn. And I'm going to make sure that the next time I sit down at a holiday table, the people sitting with me know exactly what it costs to have a man like me in their corner." I realized then that the maintenance Marcus had mocked was actually my greatest strength. I was a man who maintained things, integrity, hard work, and loyalty. The mistake wasn't in the work. It was in the people I chose to work for. Last week, I received a final letter from Sarah. It was a long, rambling apology filled with ifs and buts. She asked if we could ever be friends, if I could ever forgive her. I didn't feel anger when I read it. I just felt a profound sense of distance. I took a pen and wrote a single sentence on the back of the envelope before sending it back. I forgave you the moment I walked out into the snow. I just decided I didn't want to be the one to pay for it anymore. I'm 61 years old. My name is Elias Thorne. My credit is restored, my hip is healed, and my father's chair is exactly where it belongs, at the head of my own table, in a home where the truth is the only guest I invite. The gravy stain on that white shirt never did come out completely. I kept it, though. It's tucked away in a box in the shed. Sometimes, when I'm feeling a little too soft or a little too lonely, I take it out and look at it. It's a reminder of the night I hit the floor. It's a reminder that sometimes you have to fall hard to realize you're lying on a foundation of lies. And most importantly, it's a reminder that no matter how much someone shoves you, they can only keep you down if you agree that you don't belong in the chair. I belong. I always did. I just had to stop asking for permission to sit down. As the sun dips below the mountains and the river sings its old, constant song, I lean back in my oak chair and smile. The wood doesn't squeak as much as it used to. I finally fixed the joint. And this time I did it for me.